Hello! Hope you guys are all having a good day. My name is Miss Flores, and I will be going over the Gilded Age. More specifically, we're going to be looking at the industrialization that took place during the Gilded Age. Hopefully this video is not too long. If it is, this will be in 3 parts, and I'll let you know at the end of the video if there will be a part 2. Alright, let's go ahead and get started. So what we're looking at is we're going to be looking at kind of what led to the Gilded Age overall. And so we're going to be looking at the causes and effects that we see here. Alright, so what we see here with long-term causes is that what led to it is that there are a lot of natural resources that were abundant. So people want to use those. And due to the harnessing of early power sources like water and coal, we see the emergence of factories as well. This, of course, also was aided and helped by the invention of the steam engine and the construction of railroads, canals, roads, of course, that began to come up through all the early 1800s. Immediate causes that we see happening that led to this big business boom is the expansion of these railroads in the late 1800s. So this is during the Civil War and after the Civil War, of course, if you want to put a timeline, an idea of when this is all happening. Also, labor was cheap. Why the labor was cheap? Well, because a lot of immigrants, Irish and Chinese immigrants, are mostly noted to be the ones who worked on making these railroads and expanding them. And of course, with all those new resources, all these inventions coming about, we have this huge burst of technological innovation that comes about as well. And with all this coming up, people mass producing these new management and techniques come out, and business strategies of how to run these businesses occur as well. And investment in capital, which we'll talk about later on in this PowerPoint. So all of these causes lead to effects, right? You have a growth of large corporations, new and plentiful manufactured goods. That means there is the loss of cottage industries, which we'll talk about in a moment. Also, this led to poor working conditions. At this time, there were no laws, there wasn't acts, there wasn't anything that protected the people making these goods. So it led to poor working conditions in the factories and sweatshops. You guys may remember the Triangle Shirtwaist factory, as well as more iconic example of these poor conditions as well. We also have an increased labor activism as well, and this is where we start to see the formation of the unions pop up as well. Long-term effects, so after years of this happening, you begin now to see more regional economies becoming more linked. So before you have, let's say an example, the South is very heavily relying on agricultural cotton, right? That's our main idea that we think of during the time of the South. And it becomes much more interlinked with the North, because the North relies on that raw material of that cotton to be transformed, to be made into actual cotton fiber or fabric, so that they can then take that fabric and make shirts, to make clothes out of it, to make any kind of cloth material from it, right? So they're much more reliant on each other. We also have, like going back to labor activism, labor movements win. And one of the major wins they get were shorter work weeks. Before they were working about 6 or 7 days a week, and they shortened it to now about 5 or 6 days, right? So that is what was happening here. And with all this happening, we see a change in the demographic of where people live, right? So we see a change of where people mostly live before to when they lived then, right? So before the late 1800s, most people lived in what we call rural areas, which means farmland. There wasn't a lot of people. You can have acres and acres of land and not have anyone live right next door to you. Your neighbors might have been a mile down the road or even more. And that's rural. And we start to see a change of people leaving the farmland, leaving the rural area to go and live and work in urban cities. Urban cities are cities, right? So in Texas, that would be Austin. Dallas, Fort Worth area, right? San Antonio, El Paso, Houston, right? Houston and Galveston. These are all of these urban areas. And people leave from, I would say, Odessa, right? Well, Odessa is more of a suburb area, I guess, but like these farmland areas. So if you live in, let's say, El Paso, we have an area that is called Clint. Clint is much more of our rural area within El Paso County, right? So that's our farmland area. And people are leaving because of work. Money becomes a huge issue, and that's why people are leaving the farmlands, because there's no jobs. Most jobs are in the cities where all the factories are, right? And that's also changing where people work. Before, you would have these mom and pop shops, or even just out of your own home, and you would make things by hand. Everything was pretty much unique and everything, and that was what you called cottage industry, right? It was handmade by your mom and your grandma, right? And they would make something and then maybe sell a little bit more on the side for other people. But that all changes when factories come into play. Factories are mass produced. It's much quicker to make these. It's not taking much time. It also becomes a lot more cheaper to make these as well. Right, and with all this happening, this leads to an effect of what happens in the economy, right? Of how the U.S. makes its money, how the country makes its money. Before the Civil War, so before the 1800s, you have farming is that major investment of our money-making items, right? And then you had, of course, some side of, well, farming industry, right? The technological factories, right? And that wasn't a huge boost for our money. After the Civil War, after this railroad is connected, after we have roads, after we have all these factories being made, we start to see a change in where our money is coming from. We start to see a shift, and the shift continues to grow and grow and grow, where most of our money then becomes industry. And you'll see that later on as we look through history, right? So just a little reminder of some differences that we see with cottage industry is one, it was worked from home. Skilled workers. By skilled workers, that means that people worked many years. They practiced and honed their skills to do very, very well and be diverse in what they're doing. The products that they were making were, of course, made by hand and one at a time. All products were custom made and they are self-employed. They're making their own money from this. As opposed to, well, in the factory system, workers worked in factories, right? So they left their homes, they went to this giant building with many machines, and they did one thing for the most time. So this is where you get mostly unskilled workers, which is why they were paid less, because all they did was this one repetitive job every single day in and day out, day in, day out. And these unskilled workers may have been just like many a machine, and that was a machine that they ran, right? You also have products that were being made, were again machine made, mass produced, which made them very much cheaper. And you also see the introduction of interchangeable parts. So you start to see the standardization of machines, of these things coming about. And an example of this, what you can probably think of, is parts, right? If something breaks in a car, you can go in and get that part replaced because there's now interchangeable parts coming about. Before, that would have been much more difficult in this time period. And of course, they're not self-employed. They work for someone above them who pays them for making what they do. But overall, there is some similarities between the cottage industry and the factory system. Is one, their main goal was to produce goods, to make these products, and to sell these products for money, for profit, right? And again, this is kind of what you see. The industry is in the 1900s. So this is just entering into a new century for the U.S., right? So this is what you see here. You see the railroad system kind of really taking control of making that money, which reflects on how the U.S. ran at this time. The railroad was such an integral part of the United States and how it saves money. It was its main transportation system for people, for goods, for products, for raw materials, right? And of course, you have others falling around, like banks, industry, iron, coal, and steel becomes super important later on, and that continues to grow. Utilities become a part of tobacco, which has been something that's been part of the U.S. history since its very foundation. Right, telegraph and other transports began to occur as well. But if you also notice, food, farming, becomes not so quite important or is noticeable anymore. So let's keep in mind how we notice that shift happening, right? And of course, let's not forget, this is the age of inventions. This is the time where you start to see this creativity explode with all these new things coming about. We have the Thomas Edison phonograph, that recording, right? We also have the Kodak camera box, which takes still photos. We have Alexander Graham Bell, who invents the telephone. You have Cyrus McCormick, who makes the Reaper, which is a form of taking food from the ground, right? You also John Deere, who makes the steel plow, and you guys may notice some of these names sound familiar, and it's because they made their namesake starting here. You know, of course, let's not forget, we have Thomas Edison with motion pictures. We have, again, Thomas Edison with making the light bulb, and Tesla, along with George Washington, who make and discover the alternative current, which gives us electricity. And all of this is helped and aided by and even pushed forward by what we call is the Bessemer process. Now, before the Bessemer process, steel was stronger, was most, of course, and it's still known as today, was one of the more stronger creations than other metals by themselves. However, it was very expensive and it was a slow process to make until we have the Bessemer process, right? It was created by Henry Bessemer, who went again and invented a process to make steel rather quickly and cheaply. And all he needed was iron ore and coal. Allowing this to happen, the Bessemer process exploded and launched the U.S. into its industrial age through the Gilded Age, right? And of course, because of all this, steel was in high demand, in part due to the railroad construction. And that was such a huge part for needing steel. And of course, like I said, railroads weren't the only thing, but you have lots of other growing industries occurring. You have the meat packing industry. This might be a little cut off in the recording, but this is meat packing. You have the banking system that takes place as well, along with oil and cigarettes. This is where we get that tobacco that we saw on that pie graph earlier as well. Now, when we have all these industries growing, we have to think, who's running these, right? Well, it's corporations. Corporations are a main driver at this point. Corporations, as most importantly do, is a business that is legally independent from its owners, right? And what they do is that they issue shares of stock, which is a piece of ownership in the company. People who buy those stocks are called shareholders. The money from the stock helps the company to continuously expand, right? That's what people do in the stock market. They buy a piece of the company, they invest money in it, and if they can probably later on sell that stock for a higher price, which puts more money into the company, allowing it to grow bigger. And that's what happens. If a company does well, the stock prices will continue to grow up and shareholders make that extra bonus money, right? They get more from what they paid initially. And overall, corporations are run by what we call a board of directors. These are people who are the head of the company. Now, we're quickly reaching our time limit, so I'm going to go ahead and leave off here for part 1, and we'll wrap up part 2 for the industrialization of the Gilded Age. So keep a lookout and watch that video next. Alright, I'll see you guys in the next video.